welcome
Back.
to another episode of You Should Read This with the inimitable Tom van der Lubbe and the inimitable me, Richard Atherton. We are going to discuss another selection by Tom, which I'm very grateful for, and that is the Palliative Society. Have you got a Dutch version there?
Yeah, I have the
for
Dutch
our
one.
Dutch viewers and listeners. I'm not even going to, by Byung-Chul Han.
Byung-Chul Han,
Something like that. This guy, who is a Korean-born professor of philosophy and cultural studies who teaches at the Berlin University of Arts and the author of more than 20 books. I absolutely love this short volume, the Palliative Society. But again, I think given it was your suggestion, maybe you can fill us in with the backstory of how you came to this book and why you thought we should cover it.
Yeah, it's a little bit coincidence. So I just showing you another book.
Okay.
In German. That's one of his earlier books about the Burnout Society, and I only knew it from let's say Germany. So I thought, okay, I really liked it because for me he's somebody who writes in a very dense way. So all his books are very small. Let's say very thin. So all very thin books, but there's enormous density. So then I thought, okay, nobody ever talks about this guy, and then suddenly I saw in the Netherlands that there was a translation. They were translating his work, and then I reviewed it in Dutch, and I said, okay, it's interesting. And then suddenly I saw him over and over all the place. So sometimes it just takes time. Especially, let's say, German-speaking, let's say, or German literature, when it's not translated, you don't see it. And you only see it in the country itself or in the German-speaking area. But I think he's one of the most interesting people around at the moment. And what I find fascinating is that this guy comes from South Korea and then moves to Germany to study Heidegger, which is, it's like if we would move to South Korea or Japan and move there to study a certain philosopher, and then he becomes a professor of philosophy in Germany, which is already a brilliant starting point. And what I also like is that he writes about topics of our current society, and he puts them in a historical perspective. But he has written an excellent book. It's called Infocracy. It's about our whole data society and our mass surveillance, where he refers to Zuboff, an American professor who is pretty well known. Surveillance society, she wrote. So he takes the current topics and he connects them in a historical context, and that's why I thought, okay, I choose one book which I think is a topic. It's about pain and suffering, and I think this is the book for Richard. So I'm very curious to hear your takeaways and to discuss the book with you.
Well, I mean, as I was saying just before we came on air, and we'll get into the structure of the book, because I would like the way you sort of paced through the structure and the way it hangs together. This resonated with me at a level that I generally don't find philosophy does. I find philosophy as something to engage in terms of reading, something that is intellectually rewarding, but I very rarely read a philosophy book where, like, every other page I'm like, yeah, you said it. That's awesome. Like, that's my experience. But this did. I really felt like this visceral connection to what he's talking about. And driven by the experience I've had of feeling pain and the value it has brought to my life. And again, the point is made in different ways that you cannot experience joy and happiness without experiencing pain. They're these twins that grow up together. And if you leave your ability to experience pain stunted, then you will cap your ability to experience joy. And that has been absolutely my experience. But I've not read any other philosophical work that's that's really gone deep on that point and explored pain. And now I've, of course, now discovered, having read this, that he obviously references a number of other works which deal with pain extensively, it would seem. So perhaps this is a doorway into a whole field of philosophy that perhaps I wasn't aware of before reading this. So that off the bat, that's my my reaction to the book.
What's also perhaps interesting to say is that books on philosophy can be very complicated and very difficult to read. So not only the amount of pages, which is, let's say, if he writes a book, it's always less than 100 pages. And this density is still readable. So the opposite is more or less the case. And he also describes this. He says, every sentence I write should stand for itself. So I always said, okay, it's like you're reading, you could quote more or less every second sentence, and you could put the sentence on the wall. And I think I have never seen somebody who does this in such an extreme way. So I mean, I didn't discuss this with him, but what I would be interesting is, does he end up with a lot of more pages, and then he skips and skips and skips, and then at a certain moment, this is the leftover, but there's such a density in what is left over in those 100 pages that you're reading all the time is, oh yes, I could quote this. Yes, I could put this sentence on the wall. And that's something which I never had in such an extreme way, like I have this with his work. And it's not only this book; he does this over and over again.
Yeah, I always felt like this ought to be a rule of philosophers. You're not allowed to write books any longer than this. And I think the serious point is this could get to so many more readers in this form than obviously the standard philosophical text. So how should we do this? Should we? Do you want to kind of just step through the outline and the flow of the book?
I think we can decide our together, but let's say, I mean, there are, I don't know, 10 chapters or something, and we don't have to cover them all. But it's always pain in connection with something, with truth, or dialectic, or happiness, etc. So I think perhaps you just start by picking, let's say, the first example or sentence or chapter where you really thought, oh, this is really great to share. But I can also start. I think it's the main thing is that he just says, we live in a society where we don't want to deal with pain anymore. We live in a superficial, happy society, and everything should be positive. So this duality of you can't have only the positive side, or you especially need a negative side to value the positive, is something which he puts in a lot of different dimensions in perspective. And he just says, okay, we just try to avoid pain in all kind of different fields, and that's not good, because that's the main essence of being human, which is a good connection to your podcast.
Yes, exactly. And right at the top, so his first chapter is algophobia, which is a word I didn't know before, which means fear of pain. And that's his diagnosis, as you say. The line is, today, a universal algophobia rules, a universal fear of pain rules, a generalized fear of pain. The ability to tolerate pain is rapidly diminishing. The consequence of this algophobia is a permanent anesthesia, which I thought was it. Yeah. Okay.
Brilliant sentence.
Yeah, exactly. You're so right about the waking instruction. I hadn't thought of that, but of course, that is how he can create such a short book, is this dedication to dense sentences that are also accessible, or also highly readable. And then he goes on in the second chapter, I suppose, to lay out a little bit of the history, and talks about previous societies where torture was commonplace, where pain was out in the open. We experienced pain as part of life. And then this movement to discipline, this evolution of society towards a disciplined societies where pain is pushed into the prison system and it's taken out of public view, and the way that we experience pain changes, and it's less it's less evident in day-to-day life. It's less public. And then this evolution from a disciplined society to what he calls the neoliberal performance society that reifies happiness. And there's that pain is inconsistent with performance. And I think, and both of us, of course, work in business, and that's something that's so certainly resonated with me. In a business world obsessed with performance, we don't want to acknowledge pain. We don't want to let the hairs running, right? We don't want to touch into anything that might bring up emotion, that might bring up pain. We just want to focus on performance. We just want to focus on the bottom line. So I like the way he laid that out in that sort of historical context.
Yeah, what is also perhaps important to add for those who are familiar with the work of Foucault is, if you talk about discipline, he's a big fan of Foucault. So he's referring in all his books to Foucault. And this whole idea of discipline, just to add something to this, is that, I mean, the main thing about Foucault is that he compares, let's say, the prison, but also hospitals and factories and schools. And Foucault also refers to the architecture, for instance. So it's just closing down people somewhere to discipline them. And I think this way of seeing these different time frames, and then if you would say this, I think if you would only take one word for our current society, I think happy or happiness, and happy is for me superficial, it's not fulfillment, because fulfillment has this negative aspect of pain as well. You have to suffer to find fulfillment, but happiness is, let's say, being happy without any negative side of it. So I think this whole idea of happiness or a happy society, or it's all about happiness and about positivity, etc. I think that that's an interesting way of putting this on a historical timeline to compare this with Foucault, for those who are familiar with Foucault.
Yeah. And he finishes this second chapter. The plethora of kinds of suffering falls down like an infinite blizzard on such a human being, just as the strongest lightning flashes of pain discharge on him. Only in this condition, always open to pain from all sides and down to the deepest level, can he be open to the subtlest and highest kinds of happiness. And he's quoting Nietzsche there.
Yeah, because Nietzsche always says pain and happiness are brother and sister, twins.
Yeah, twins.
They grow together.
Yeah, I love that line.
And you can't separate them. But you also see it in yin and yang, in the Asian, let's say, societies. That you can't have only half of it. And let's say in our very, let's say, modern society dominated by, let's say, especially American way of thinking, is that we only want to have the positive stuff.
Yeah.
And we avoid any way of contradictions, difficulties. And then he just splits this in a lot of different chapters. It's about truth, it's about literature, it's about dialectics, ethics, etc. And then he shows again and again that we don't want to confront ourselves with difficult stuff, negative stuff. And in the beginning of the book, and I think that's also a good starting point, he talks about feel-good art. And he's quoting Adorno. And that's also what you see nowadays. In the past, you had theater and art, etc., and it was kind of mirror. You wanted to be confronted, and you wanted to be, let's say, in a way, also, I wouldn't say left alone with your thoughts, but you would if you go to a theater, you want to be confronted, and you want to get a mirror. So I go to the theater to be left alone with questions about our society. And good literature does this. It leaves you with questions to think about moral questions, about our society, about truth, etc. And it's not about going to the theater and just laughing all the time because it's so funny. No, it's serious stuff, and the serious stuff is much more interesting than the funny stuff.
Yeah.
Or the funny stuff has another layer in it.
Yes.
That you laugh, and then at a certain point you still laugh, but it's not to laugh about, and you realize that it's not funny. There's also this tradition of humor where it's very serious humor.
Yeah.
And I think to take feel good art as an example is a good low starting point to show the point he wants to make.
Yeah.
In the book.
Yeah. In the third chapter, Survival, he starts to analyze our experience of COVID and links it to our obsession with survival. He talks about how life is completely paralyzed into survival, and this fear of pain he links with fear of death. That as much as we're algophobic, we're also he introduced this new word, which is fear of death. Thantophobic, is it? And that we also fear death, and that pain, he says somewhere else, is like a mini death, right? Yeah. And that's absolutely my experience of pain. Like a little part of us dies when we feel pain, but that also releases us. That somehow lightens our soul, right? It gives us a little bit more space to feel joy, and the fact that as a society we were so willing to enter into quarantine and lockdown and have all of these privileges taken away and have our lives reduced, and the devastation that caused is linked to this obsession with survival. Thantophobia, that's the word. Thantophobia, fear of death. He says algophobia is ultimately thantophobia. And that resonated for me. We don't want to look at death. We don't want to accept death. And as he describes it, we reduce life to a biological process that must be optimized. This whole idea that we want to hack our bodies to optimize our biological experience on Earth, without an appreciation for a metaphysical dimension, as he puts it, a sort of richer understanding of what it means to be alive. Digital hypochondria, constant self-measurement with the aid of health and fitness app, degrades life into a mere function.
You also see this about longevity, huh? That let's say in the end it's also a reaction of our secularization, that we want to have an eternal life, but we don't realize that if we would have an eternal life, life is not life anymore. But it's also see what you see in Buddhism. So I think in this chapter you see also his Asian Buddhist probably background. But if you, for instance, read Dalai Lama, etc., this obsession of the Western culture to live in the future all the time and to try to avoid death means that you're let's say in different small episodes you're dying. And I think he explains this and writes this. He says also, for instance, we become older without becoming. I would let's say, if I would translate it, being mature. So it's also okay in a kind of mental way. We also stay forever young. And we want to be, let's say, from a superficial way, we want to be forever young. So if we're 60, we're wearing the jeans of a 60-year-old. We want to have a skin of a 20-year-old when we're 80, which becomes a little bit ridiculous also if you watch this. So we find it very difficult to become old. And he says, but it has to do that we are not able to finish our lives in a way of finding fulfillment. So this reflection on where is life about, because we push this away. We don't want to be confront ourselves with the end of life. We don't want to be confront ourselves with what is fulfillment, what is another layer. Now we want to be on a superficial happiness level, and we want to stay on the superficial happiness level forever young. So we want to be. We don't want to grow up also in a mental way. Yeah. Which I think he explains in a very good way, and that's also that we push this away. We don't want to talk about this. We want to confront ourselves with this. It's something which we totally neglect.
Yeah. And I think you're right to make the link with Buddhism, because, of course, the Buddhists have very strong traditions of talking about death.
Yeah.
And that being a spiritual practice is to.
But the Stoics is the tradition as well, huh? So you're in the Stoics. I don't have to explain you, but let's say it's just to think about the worst thing which can happen, and then ask yourself, okay, if all the worst stuff happens in your life, write it down, and then, okay, what's next is something which, if you would just ask somebody during a dinner party, you will not be invited anymore, because that's something we don't want to discuss this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there is an acceptance of suffering as being part of life, and confronting our suffering as an important philosophical practice, right, that comes from Stoicism. But I still think that Stoicism still has this, to me at least, there is some embedded reticence to really look at pain per se, right? There's this idea in Stoicism that we want to control and manage our feelings, right? And that's a really important idea in Stoicism. And of course, there is the need for us to be able to do that, to navigate life, and that it's an important point that is made in Stoicism. But we also must surrender to our pain, right? It's also very important to surrender to pain, to yield to pain, to embrace that sort of feminine aspect and go with it. Like I said to you before we came online, I was reading a newspaper article last night, and I just was bawling with tears, and I just let the tears stream over like some article in the newspaper. But that is so important to let that go, to engage in that grief and create the space for more joy in my life. I personally, I believe that
the sentence I really liked in this chapter, in my Dutch book, it's on 39. Right. He writes, the paradox of the pain syndrome is that the less pain we have, the more we suffer.
Yes.
So that's let's say also our level of acceptance or resistance or coping with pain becomes lower and lower all the time. Which I think is something which is really true. But especially in our, let's say, Western world, where we don't really suffer, which doesn't mean that there aren't people suffering.
Right. Yeah. Or we have I think we don't have material suffering, right, in the same way that other societies do, but we do suffer. And so often we choose suffering over pain. And we'd rather endure chronic suffering over time than experience acute pain. And the route out of the chronic suffering often is to yield to the pain that's beneath the suffering, in my experience.
What I find very interesting is the next chapter about a kind of he quotes a lot of German literature all the time. So he quotes Ernst Jünger, who has written about pain, and then he makes a connection to do you call it dullness or something like that? That he says, okay, if it just goes by, and it's a kind of passive consuming attitude. It's also a kind of modular pain, so to say. So and we do it to ourselves. So by just avoiding difficult stuff, difficult books, the difficult writings, etc., we go for the superficial stuff. But it's also it creates it's boring. So if you really would ask somebody, and it's also a confrontation, you would you see if you would, let's say, I stay with this dinner party, and you would ask somebody, or you meet somebody, we ask, what do you do for work, more or less. So it's about what kind of status do you have, and what's the last thing you bought, and what's your last holiday. This is the kind of discussion we have, and it's common ground. It's a kind of small talk. If you would just enter at a dinner party and say, okay, what's the last philosophical book you read?
Yeah.
It really impressed you. I would say, hey, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
So which I mean, I don't want to say that if you join a dinner party and you are a guest, that's the starter. That should be the starter, but it's still also a question: where do these really profound discussions take place, or do they take place at all, or did we skip them?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
what is the superficial stuff we spend our time with, and what's the profound stuff? What are the really good conversations we remember?
Yeah.
And I mean, when are conversations really interesting? Often when you have opposite opinions, when there is an acceptance for the person, but you have a lively discussion, doesn't matter on what topic. That's interesting. And then you have to work on the discussion because somebody is challenging you.
Yeah.
If you have a superficial discussion and we exchange that we both liked our last holidays, you won't remember that discussion.
Yeah. No, that's right. I'm not sure exactly which chapter it's in, but he talks about the likability that we create. That everything's about whether we like it. You know, we've reduced society to expressing our like, and we want everything to be likable, right? And I think and capitalism is a big driving force of that, as I see it. You know, we want to make everything likable and as unoffensive as possible, and you now see that in social media. You know, we cancel people who cause too much outrage and pain for people. We create feeds that just present us with information that we like. We live in these likable bubbles, right? And and that bleeds over into personal lives. We seem to, it's back to the same point. We have less tolerance for pain in general, and we have less tolerance for pain in conversation. And it is painful to be confronted with a belief that differs to our own, that cuts to the heart of our values in a way that we find difficult to accept. Those are painful experiences, and the digital realms that we inhabit especially anesthetize us to pain, which of course is where he started in the first chapter.
Yeah, there's also this whole idea of the echo chamber. Huh? You're in a kind of echo chamber, and you have the algorithm and social media. But we do this also in normal society. So we don't want to be confronted with people who have a different opinion, but we meet people with the same opinion. I mean, if you also see, let's say, the political development in the US in the past, let's say it was not a problem to have another political color. So Democrats and Republicans in the same family discuss topics, and that was okay. And then you have this kind of polarization going on. And at a certain time in families, people don't talk. If you're a Republican, you don't talk to somebody who's a Democrat anymore. And that's on the political field. But if he, for instance, in the chapter "Pain as Truth," he says, and that's also an excellent quote to my point of view. Truth means that there's pain inside, because the truth has this aspect of pain, because it's confronting. But it's also confronting, or it's if you tell somebody something that can be very confronting, but it also can be a starting point for a discussion. Yeah. And it also has to do with, for instance, and he dives to put it very personal. He's quoting Alain Badiou, and it's a commercial, and it says about love. It says about dating sites, you can fall in love without pain.
Right.
But I mean, that's classical. I mean, it's a very classical topic, that pain, or that love always has this duality of suffering, because somebody doesn't love you, you love, and then you suffer and you cry as a teenager. It's a romanticism, etc. But now we want to fall in love, but we don't want to be neglected. We don't want to have the answer, no, I don't love you. But that's where literature comes from. About suffering, about a writer who says, oh, I love this woman, is this, but she doesn't love me. And you can't have it. And then he says, without pain, we have never loved or ever lived, which is in a way also true. So the more you have suffered, the more you value life. Topic we also often see in literature, that people who suffer enormously, take Viktor Frankl as an example, in the surviving the concentration camps, this energy and this will to live would have been a totally different context without this concentration camp.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an extreme example, which doesn't mean you should apply to be in a concentration camp or be jealous of Viktor Frankl, but Viktor Frankl wouldn't be the person he has become without this experience he describes about the concentration camp. It's an extreme example, but it's about love, I think, is a very good example. Everybody really has experienced him or herself in his own life.
Yeah, that's right. And we don't get rejection in the same way, right? In the digital realm, right? We're just ghosted. We just don't hear from that person. They don't say,
we swipe.
Yeah,
I mean, Tinder apps, etc.
It's not like we go to the dance, we ask the girl, and the girl says no, and we feel the pain of it. It's like the girl doesn't respond, so I'll just keep swiping, right?
Or in our, I don't know. I mean, it depends on your kind of relationship. Let's say you fall in love when you're very young, and she says, "No, I don't love you. Sorry." It's the example of the dance, and we suffered. And we had to deal with that. And perhaps we cried for nights and nights. and nobody could help us at that moment, and we had to deal with it.
Yeah. And there's not a dozen other girls on our phone we can console ourselves with. And, yeah, right. It's a different world. He also the other point that's made in this chapter. I think we're on the same chapter. This is the Poetics of Pain. This link with healing. Pain causes the mind to erect a healing, livable counterworld in which everything appears in a new, seductive light. The tremendous tension imparted to the intellect by its desire to oppose and counter pain makes him see everything he now beholds in a new light. And the unspeakable stimulus which any new light imparts to things is often sufficiently powerful to deny all temptation to self-destruction and to make continuing to live seem to the sufferer extremely desirable. Pain enlivens the imagination. For Nietzsche, art is a saving sorceress with the power to heal and can spirit away that is unbearable and terrifying about existence. So they're starting he starts to draw out this link between pain and healing. But also the ability. Well, sorry, go on.
No, it's I'm in the same chapter, because I think it's also interesting to make the link to where you still see this works. I mean, he's talking about Schubert and the songs of Schubert, but I don't know if people are familiar with this and the Winterreise. But let's say if you just take contemporary music, and if you talk about love songs or suffering or losing somebody, and if you talk about great hits, then there often is something where people suffer, and have lost somebody, and then great songs are written. If you just write about just, let's say, watching the sky and writing about nature, that also can be an excellent song. But there are a lot of literature and songs where people are angry or feel pain or injustice, etc. And then great music is written. And if nothing would happen in the life of this musician, if they wouldn't suffer from injustice or pain, those songs wouldn't be written. So I mean, he is the one who takes the classical examples, and Kafka and Schubert. It's very German focused, but just take modern pop music as a very good example.
Yeah, and this is it sort of echoes what we were saying earlier, that the importance of art having this component of pain, and it's art allowing us to access our pain that provides us with healing. Great art is healing. And he says later in this chapter, within the palliative society, pain is not a navigable river, not a narrative flow leading man down to the sea, but a dead-end street. That made a lot of sense to me. Like, in our current society, pain is not a navigable river. It's something we try to avoid, right? It is a dead end. Oh, don't go down there. Stay away from there. That's a dead end. Rather than pain being part of the flow of life, being part of the river we're all in.
Just and let it flow, or let it lean into it, or embrace it instead of running away from it. And so what he also says is in this chapter about dialectic. I don't know if I pronounced correctly. Hegel, dialectic. He says, okay, the pain is the motor, is the engine of the dialectic development of the brain or of your thinking. And that's, I think, something which we also already all have experienced, that if you walk away from it, it doesn't solve it. It doesn't solve your problems. You have to accept it. You have to let it go. You have to confront yourself with it. You have to take time. And I mean, you can put it in a kind of cupboard for yourself, a kind of mental game. But the question is, okay, how do I react to what happens in my life? Can I deal with this? Does it make me stronger? Does it make me more mature? Does it develop my way of thinking? Does it develop my maturity, or do I run away from it? And do I stay forever young and immature?
Yeah. That's right. And something he doesn't touch on, but I think is an important aspect here is this idea of embodiment. Because at least for me, pain is something I experience in my body, in my whole body. And I think he doesn't touch on this, but for me, that it feels like that's another trend that's part of what we're talking about here. Part of the palliative society is a disembodied society. It's a society where we're in our heads, right? Everything is a mental activity, and we're not encouraged to feel into our bodies, to connect into our bodies, and that's where the pain is.
Yeah, he writes about it. He says we don't touch each other anymore.
Ah, okay, he does write about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know. I think it's an ontology of pain or something, or no, ethics of pain. And he says the other becomes an object. The other disappears. Closeness means, and there's also this framing of COVID, where we have this idea of social distancing. So, which is interesting, because if you have this let's say religious tradition, or if you take lepra of Mother Teresa, or caring about the people who suffer, these were the monasteries, etc., and the hospitals with the religious background, where the door was always open. They didn't say, no, we don't want you.
Right.
We keep social distance. So that's also something we push people away. We're not embracing people in our society and touch them.
Yep.
Which Mother Teresa did, and said, "Oh no, I care for the people who have lepra. I get them from the streets." And that's the opposite of social distancing.
Yeah.
And that's what he describes. So he says it becomes also in that way a kind of artificial distant society. And he says the empathy goes away. It's a kind of voyeuristic, I don't know if it's the right word for this, pleasure to see the suffering of others is perhaps not enough to understand this diminishing of the empathy, but the other disappears in our society because we want to eliminate pain as such. But you also see this in a lot of societies where disabled persons or elderly, etc., depending on how much money a society has, you put them away. You put them in an elderly home, or you put people who are disabled, you put them away. You don't see them because it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's the tram has to stop a little bit longer to get the wheelchair on board. So this whole idea of empathy disappears.
Yeah.
But it also has to do with, I think, the secularization of our society, because in the past we were told from the pulpit every week that we had to care about our neighbor, at least when the person had the same religion.
Yeah. Well, that's right, and something I suppose, we don't really get into in this book, but that's also, I think there's a link between happiness and our ability to feel pain, and there's equally a link between happiness and the extent to which we're virtuous in life. But often, to be virtuous, we have to experience some pain, right? But to engage in virtuous acts is often to engage in suffering, right? If it's virtuous to look after our elderly parents, let's say, within the house, and I'm not saying I'm going to do this, by the way, but that's going to take some suffering on my part to experience their decline firsthand. That would be virtuous, and it may lead to my happiness, but it's going to come with suffering.
Yeah, and it's also what we also know is that, let's say, connection or connecting to others is much easier when you suffer together, or someone is suffering. Let's say if you would visit a friend in the hospital who is severely ill, there will be a kind of maturity in this relationship, because visiting somebody in the hospital is really ill and doesn't know if perhaps he or she will survive. You will have a different conversation.
Yeah.
But what you hear from people who work in hospitals is that people find it, I also experience this myself, find it very difficult to visit people in the hospital. Because if you visit somebody who is dying, you are confronted with the fact, memento mori, that you also could be dying. You also could be the one who is in the hospital bed. So better don't visit this person in the hospital.
Yeah.
But if we really want to connect, then we should be there in friendships when friends are suffering, when they are in divorce, when they have problems with their children, when they have other shit in their lives. Then we should connect with them and call them and say, "Hey, Richard, how are you?" But it's difficult because it confronts ourselves with that part of life. That's why I always ask, and you see this all the time, and social media also plays a dominant role in that. We're always on the sunny side of life.
Yeah.
We're always happy, and we only post this kind of impressions when we are happy, which gives us a kind of common understanding that all the others are always happy, and we are the losers who are suffering.
Yeah. And related to that, and I love this. I mean, he deals a lot with the sort of digital realm in the ontology of pain. This chapter, and something he says here, which I think is interesting: the pain of the nearness of distance is alien to the digital order. So there's this paradox here. Where on the one hand, we've lost close connection with people, but through the digital realm, we can feel like we're connected, right? We have this illusion of connectedness with others. And what does Mark Zuckerberg talk about? Connecting the world. But the pain of the nearness of distance is alien, because we're not bringing close to us, oh, that person is not with me. We're not allowing ourselves to feel that the loss of distance from another, because we can instantly see their face or we can instantly send them a message. Whereas in reality, these people aren't in our real physical lives; they're distant. So the pain of the nearness of distance is alien to the digital order. I like that. The digital order transforms nearness into the absence of distance, so that it is no longer painful. Under the compulsion of availability, everything is rendered accessible and consumable. The digital habitus is everything must be available at once. The telos of the digital order is total availability. This order lacks the slowness of the hesitant shyness in the face of what cannot be done. Yeah, everything is there all the time, and we don't experience the pain of distance.
What I find, let's say, is a kind of climax in this last chapter, which is called The Last Human Being. I don't know how they translate it in English.
The last man. You were a bit. Yours is more politically politically correct.
Last man. And if you, for instance, would, because I mean I have to translate it. If you would, for instance, read the last two sentences where it is about a painless life, I found also from a language point of view excellent, and I think is a kind of this kind of density we talk about all the time is shown at its best.
Yeah, well, I can read the English. Yeah. The pain-free life of permanent happiness is not a human life. Life which tracks down and drives out its own negativity, cancels itself out. Death and pain belong together. In pain, death is anticipated. If you seek to remove all pain, you will have to also abolish death. But life without death and pain is not human life. It is undead life. God, and didn't it sort of feel like that at elements times during the pandemic? You felt like you're walking with the undead. In order to survive, humans are abolishing themselves. They may succeed in becoming immortal, but only at the expense of life itself. Yeah, powerful stuff.
And also, I'm always a little bit jealous, I have to say, I have to admit, that, for instance, his last sentence, I mean, would I be able to write in this way? I'm not, and we will be immortal, but at the cost of life itself. I mean, I find it really amazing. And what's also interesting is that let's say the books he refers to, it's not a lot. It's perhaps also only 100 remarks, but also the tough stuff or the difficult stuff. There's a lot of Hayek, Jünger, Nietzsche, Adorno, Foucault, but also modern ones like Eva Illouz. I don't know if you know her.
No.
A professor who teaches, for instance, in Israel, writes about suffering, about love. So it's also an introduction if you really like the stuff. There's enough. There's enough in let's say further reading if you search for the more profound books, so to say.
Yeah, and also think, because I've read Heidegger to some degree in the past, and what he does is he brings a modern lens on. So he helped me, I think, to interpret Heidegger, for example.
Yeah, it's difficult stuff.
So and I mean Heidegger, even students of philosophy, right, will admit they find Heidegger difficult. So
we can review if you want sign on site. It's in the bookshelf here, but let's say I read it in German, and then if I would have to translate it in English, I think I would really reach to my limits. But so I really think, let's say, he discusses really difficult stuff, but in a very accessible way, which is for really deep philosophy very, very difficult. I mean, it's and I let's say it's, and what we also said in the beginning, it's very thin. It only has 100 pages, but it must be a hell of a lot of work to create this density in such a good readable way.
Yeah, that's right. He's a very talented writer. Okay, all right. Well, mission complete. We've reviewed the Palliative Society. Thank you, Tom, for the suggestion.
Thank you, Richard.
And it's really having me think we should stick to these philosophical texts. I'm really enjoying them. Thanks once again.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my fantastic co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material in this show resonated with you, if you're thinking, perhaps, how could I take these ideas and apply them in my own leadership or take them forward into my own organization, then I would love to have a conversation with you about that. If that feels like that could be a valuable use of your time, then please do click on the Calendly link in the description for this episode, and that will allow you to book a slot directly into my calendar. And I hope to speak to you soon.